Towards the end of World War II, Joseph Stalin began to subjugate Eastern Europe using salami tactics, a divide-and-conquer strategy used to overcome the opposition. In response, the US developed the Truman Doctrine to counter the USSR geopolitical expansion at the beginning of the Cold War. Convinced that losing Berlin would mean losing all of Germany, the US knew that surrendering was not an option. The Berlin Blockade was just an episode in the war between the two superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, and it all started with different aims that the US and the USSR wanted to achieve with Germany. The US, alongside Britain, already disagreed with the Soviet Union in July of 1945 at the Potsdam Conference about this topic. The disagreement between Stalin and the Western leaders ultimately led to the Berlin Blockade. From the constant struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union to the two differentiating views on what to do with Germany, the Berlin Blockade unfolded. One side of the US military wanted to go to war and strongly believed that nuclear weapons would have the best effect against the Soviets. On the other hand, the Truman administration sought a compromise of preserving Germany as a communist-free nation rather than fighting a full-out war. Without engaging in any nuclear action with the Soviets, the United States was able to act as an ancillary to the people of Germany throughout the Berlin crisis.
One of the major events that occurred in the war was towards the end, when Franklin Roosevelt died in April 12, 1945, leaving Vice President Harry Truman to take control of the United States for the war. Although the two members of the executive office worked together, the two had very different views on the Soviet Union. While Roosevelt planned on becoming a warm ally of the Soviets, Truman held a different opinion.
He and most of the US officials grew suspicious of Soviet intentions of Europe, as it already had control of Eastern Europe. It wasn't until the Potsdam Conference where Truman personally met Stalin and his high demands, where he began to lose interest. The Potsdam Conference discussed the 4 territorial claims of Germany and the intentions for the country, as well as the fate of Europe. Western allies looked to help rebuild Germany, while the Soviet Union wanted to dismantle it to rebuild themselves after the great losses from the war. Concluding the conference, the 3 allied nations made an open agreement to the reparations of Germany, contrary to in the Yalta Conference when Germany was going to pay for their own repairs. Another impactful topic that was discussed was the menacing communist advance towards Western Europe. Poland was already beginning to form a communist government when Stalin arrested all non-communist leaders. Throughout the entire conference, the Big Three constantly had disagreements and simply could not resolve all the problems that were at hand, making it the start of the separation of allies.
The United Nations Organization.
Tensions began to rise in Europe as the Western Allies drifted away from the Soviets, acknowledging the conflict with Winston Churchill's Sinews of Peace speech that addressed the advancement of Stalin's Iron Curtain and that the Western powers might once again need to prepare for conflict. Truman expressed his opinion on the ordeal with the Truman Doctrine, which was the key foreign policy that stated that the US will fight against communism and protect Western Europe. The states supplied limited relief assistance, reconstruction loans, and other techniques, but ultimately everything led to millions being unemployed and unfed. This was of course because of industrial and agricultural production lagging behind due to destruction of factories in the war. Germany's economy only led to more depression throughout the country, and many citizens looked towards communism, as capitalism was only leading to failure.
Not wanting any more countries to join the Iron Curtain, the United States formed the Marshall Plan, an arrangement made to rebuild Europe, but also make sure countries don't look towards communism. The plan started with the Europeans taking the initiative and creating a joint pledge by all countries in need of US assistance. This way, there will be a lasting effect and all countries will be able to be helped. By 1951, this pledge was able to increase productivity and industrialization by 25%. Russia, being invaded 2 times by the Germans in the last, feared the country being brought back to life.
In January of 1947, Britain and the US joined their zones together, creating a new zone they called Bizonia. This caused the Russians to believe that the Western Allies are trying to build a stronger Germany, leading to more conflict. The Allied Control Council of Germany started deteriorating as a result of the 2 completely separate nations, and when the United States made a 60-day ultimatum for an all-zone reform, the Soviets finally withdrew on March 20th of 1948. Then, on the 1st of June that same year, America and Britain announced the creation of the new nation Western Germany, influencing the new currency that was produced in Bizonia and Western Germany on the 23rd of June. The people of Eastern Europe started to change their currency to the new one that was produced because they thought it was more valuable. On June 15th, the Autobahn was blocked by the Soviets due to repairs, and finally on June 24th, all roadways from west to East Germany were blockaded, starting the Berlin Blockade. Berlin was deep inside East Germany, and the Soviets knew that if Germany was going to be separated, Berlin would no longer be the capital. This conflict of values added stress, and as George F. Kennan, the ambassador to the Soviet Union, recalled, no one was sure as yet how the Russian move could be countered or whether it could successfully be countered at all. The situation was dark and full of danger. This helped back up the idea of the predicament of whether to stay or leave Berlin. The Western Allied nations chose to stay in Berlin even though it was a tough call to make, which then affected the resolving of the conflict. In order to supply Berlin while deep in the Soviet zone, the Western Allies compromised the conflict with Operation Vittles, which started in June 24, 1948. The initial goal of the operation was to supply Berlin in a short term, as leaders speculated that the airlift would not be enough to supply the entirety of Berlin. However, as time went on, it was clear that it was the best source of action. The airlift would start with just 32 cargo planes dropping 80 tons of relief supplies to Berlin. Other countries soon joined in, and by June 28th, France, Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and the South Africa aircraft and crewmen assisted. Different aircrafts were being used as well, with the C-47 Skytrains being used, only being able to hold 4,500 tons of cargo daily. By September, C-54s with 5,000 tons replaced the Skytrains. The famed Western journalist Joseph Kingsbury Smith was one of the many different journalists that frequently sent out questions to Joseph Stalin, and usually no answer ever emerged. But for him, Stalin made a reply saying a compromise of that if on January 30th the Western powers held back creation of a state for West Germany, the blockade would be lifted.
This new piece of information was very important, and the American diplomat Philip Jessup started gaining more information from Yakov Malik, a member of Communist Foreign Affairs Service. There, Malik stated that if a date for the ministers of both powers meeting were agreed on, they would finally lift the blockade. The agreement was finally expressed to the public on May 4th, and the blockade was finally lifted in the midnight of May 11th. A total of 278,000 flights were made and 2.3 million tons of cargo were transported. Although the blockade was lifted, the political predicament had not yet been resolved. The success of the airlift gave the Western powers access to their rights, and the legacy of the airlift is crucial to the future of U.S. foreign policies.
The airlift finally impacted the Soviets to tear down the blockade, but the fact still remains that the political situation still hadn't been resolved. The decisions made by the USSR to create a blockade that would separate a city would not only lead to increased conflict, but diminish the European desire for communism. The Berlin blockade ended up being the very first conflict between the USSR and the Western Allied nations, setting a precedent for the remainder of the Cold War. The lifting of the blockade caused by the airlift's continuous support of Western Berlin and left a legacy that would be uncontested in the years to come. The US acting as an auxiliary would manifest in the hearts of the Soviets and subside incoming violence in the Cold War and future conflicts.
Something like the Berlin Airlift, to know the achievements of American leadership in the past. One hopes for American leadership in the future.